Hello and welcome to the Total Soccer Show. I am Daryl Grove. I am not joined by Taylor Rockwell today, but I do have a special guest for you. His name is Ted Knutson. Ted is an expert in soccer analytics. He's been head of analytics at Brentford and at FC Midtjylland, and his advice and analysis are consistently sought by professional soccer teams, as you'll hear about on today's show. Whether or not you're into soccer stats and analytics, you're in for a treat. If you like stats, Ted is one of the top guys. If you maybe are not into stats, find them difficult to understand, Ted is one of the guys that's very good at explaining what these numbers mean and representing them in a way that's easy to understand. Ever wondered how expected goals work? That will be explained in this show. So what you're about to hear in this interview is a bit of Ted's biography. You'll learn that I am not good at spotting accents, how he came to apply analytics to soccer, what he has planned next, and a bit about how statistics are being used in the United States and in Major League Soccer. So I'm joined by Ted Knutson from Statsbomb. Ted, hello, and thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Sure, glad to be here.
We were just chatting before we started. You are in Bath in England, is that correct?
That's right.
I also know from your LinkedIn profile, which I managed to get a look at, that you studied over here in the United States, University of Oklahoma, and also at Emory in Atlanta. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a long time ago at this point.
I won't reveal the dates. But I feel like I pick up some sort of Northern European accent. I want to say maybe Dutch or Scandinavian.
I don't know. I grew up in Chicago, so it might be some of that. And then lived in Oklahoma and then Virginia. I actually lived in Charlottesville for 7 years.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you're American?
Then Curacao in the Netherlands, Antilles, and finally Bath. Moved to Bath right around 7 years ago.
Oh, so you are an international man of mystery?
I guess so. I'm just me.
Or an international man of analytics. How about that?
Okay, sure. That one works for me.
So the first thing I want to ask you about, before we get into sort of any sort of complicated statistical stuff, which is kind of why I want to talk to you, because I want to get some explanations of things that I don't quite understand, is a bit of your biography and sort of how you evolved from, I assume, studying sort of statistical models to applying it to soccer. Because I first became aware of you through the website statsbomb.com and the radars, and then I've read stories about you doing sort of analytics work for Midtjylland and Brentford. But I'd love to know how all those things connect together. So where does it all start?
Okay, 1998 World Cup. I was a senior at university, finishing up, I think, and I was working a job in the evenings, and the World Cup was on. And where I grew up, we didn't have soccer at the time. Like it wasn't out in the country yet.
Right.
So I didn't have a chance to play when I was a kid. Played a lot of different sports. And then I was watching with a friend of mine like pretty much every day. I was like, this is amazing. I love the sport. So I started playing with the international students in the summertime. And oh my God, it was so hot. But anyway, like that kind of kindled a love for the sport. So back in those days, I was watching like Fox Soccer World or Fox Soccer Channel for like 2 hours of highlights every week for the Premier League. And then, I ended up as part of a small gambling syndicate in 2006 with some friends of mine that were Magic the Gathering players. And that ended up changing dramatically when the UGA legislation hit at the end of 2006. It made it hard to gamble online, play poker online, etc.
Okay.
So one of us had to leave the country, and that one happened to be me. So I ended up working for Pinnacle Sports, and we basically, in one fell swoop, yesterday. So in 2007, they cut off 65% of their customers in one day. All the U.S. customers got cut off. And then within 3 months, I was down there and a friend of mine, and started working for them, building products for them, which included live sports, which included soccer, which included, I rebuilt the tennis department, European basketball, hockey, those sorts of things. So I spent 4 years down in Curacao, starting as a data guy, and then ended up running most of the operation there. And then my wife got pregnant with our second kid, and we moved here to the UK. But it was very focused on soccer at the time. I ended up trading the English Premier League as the lead trader for almost the entire time that I was there, until the point that I left. So that was 8 years. And then I met Matthew Benham, and actually a guy named Ricardo Larendart, who was working at Brentford at the time, and ended up talking to Ricky about what could be done in recruitment with sort of statistics, and they were frustrated because they go to these conferences, and in these conferences it's just the same thing over and over again. And a place like Brentford was never going to develop Udinese's scouting network. It was not going to be possible for them. So they're like, what?
Resources issue.
Well, it's not just resources, but it's expertise as well. Like and they're a tiny place out in West London. So I talked to them about what I'd been working on for about a year and a half at that point, which was looking at player profiling and scouting and taking some of the principles that we looked at in baseball and on the gambling side and applying it to player development and player identification. And so we talked about that, and they decided that was interesting, and I did some consulting work and then came on full time in pretty much the end of August of 2014.
So does Statsbomb come before or after that?
Statsbomb started in 2013. Basically, there were a bunch of guys writing on blogs. I was like, well, it makes sense to start to centralize this, because I think that, stats in soccer or football is going to grow. And also, like, it's even just for me, it's hard for me to find everybody's silly blog pages. I have to look up their Twitter accounts and stuff. So, we put that together, and it was Benjamin Pugsley and I, and also Ben's brother Danny did a little bit of work on like some cricket. Colin Traynor came along, started writing there, and then it kind of kept growing into what it is now. And we always looked at it as a place that you can find quality analysis in football. And to some extent, we've pushed really hard, and we haven't had as much writing on the site as a lot of other people might have, because we always just wanted to maintain a really high level of quality.
Okay, yeah, instead of just pushing out.
Yeah, it's just that's what we wanted to do, and I think because of that, you've seen a lot of the guys that have written on there go on to get hired either by clubs or they write in media now. So it's been a good launching pad for people.
Could you give me some names? Is there anyone I should be sort of looking out for?
Colin Traynor worked for a Premier League club last year. James York, who's the managing editor of the site, also writes for ESPN FC Insider.
You also do the podcast with him, right?
Yeah. Mike Goodman was on Grantland and also writes for ESPN. There are a couple of others that I'm sure I'm forgetting, but there are people that have gone on to pretty cool little jobs, and they mostly started with us.
I also want to ask you, before we get back to Statsbomb, because I specifically want to ask about the radars in a second, just to give you a heads up. But I want to ask about your time at Brentford and at Midtjylland, and sort of your thoughts on sort of, was it successful, and like why it came to an end in both cases?
It came to an end because the club was in a bit of a cost cutting mode at I guess it was the beginning of 2016. I can't go into a lot of details, but they cut the academy back and they cut our department back. And to be honest, like, we had done pretty much all of the work to do the summer recruitment by the February. Like, we work way ahead of the time curve. And so they decided that, in order to save a bunch of wages for our department, they would let us go, and they may revisit at some point. But so that's what happened there. Was it successful? I think it probably was. Like, Brentford were in the playoffs the first year that I was there. Midtjylland won their league. I worked on the set piece program at Midtjylland. So basically, the owner asked me, is it possible that we could do a lot better at set pieces? Is it possible we can innovate this? And no one's really looking at it, I think. But I think this might be a competitive edge that we could develop. So the first 6 weeks, I spent a lot of time reviewing that, and we put together kind of a comprehensive program of best practices, of ways to do things better, a lot of places, a lot of coaches don't have expertise in this area, and a lot of people just think that it's random, and I can tell you for a fact it's not. So success in that area ended up being a big driver towards Midtjylland winning the league.
Can you settle an old debate? Man marking or zonal marking? Is there any statistical evidence for or against either?
Well, there's no statistical evidence because you need to have tracking data in order to do it, and widespread tracking data is not available. I think, to answer it generally, my approach would adjust on a team-by-team basis on what their strengths are.
That makes sense. That's a very sensible answer, I want to say. Can I also ask
it's a lot like American football. You look at what you're likely to face, you construct your scheme around it, and then you innovate as you go.
I want to also ask you about you mentioned some transfer recommendations that you made for Brentford, I think, many months in advance of the summer window, I guess. Is that literally presenting a list of player names and sort of statistical evidence for why those players would fit? Is it like literally handing over a dossier to the people who will be doing the buying?
Sure. So basically we do a hybrid process, and I think that's the right way to go about it. So we would use generally stats to find the best statistical profiles. We would also scout certain leagues, like League One in England doesn't have a lot of statistical coverage. So we'd spend a lot of time scouting that. Other leagues as well that we thought were high profile, but we couldn't get data for. We would take names from agents that come in, names from different people that worked on the other side of the businesses that Matthew owns. They had a lot of soccer analysts for Smart Odds as well. And so we'd look at all that and we'd boil that into a process that said that, okay, what do the stats for this guy look like? We can do that pretty quickly. And then if he passes the first check, then we go on to do video scouting of them. And video scouting takes a lot more time generally, but it's also a required part of the process. Like sometimes you just see things that you wouldn't immediately flag a guy up as, oh yeah, well, he's not going to fit our style, or he's got this really bad habit that I think would be dangerous for us to actually sign. It's a risk. And so that's kind of the combination of stuff that we would do. And then guys that made it through the whole process, that passed the statistical check, passed the scouting, passed the background check for like, attitude or injury history, etc. Then we would rank them as a positional list, and then we would present them to the director of football and the coaches.
So it sounds to me like what you've been getting at is, and I guess this is true just sensibly, that it's not about analytics and statistics replacing what currently exists. It's more sort of adding an extra layer. When you mention that series of checks, it's almost like you've added one more layer that other clubs wouldn't usually add.
Absolutely, and it's extremely important to get more objective information into football. Like, so many things are an opinion, and the problem that you run into is different people have different opinions, and if you can't find either a consensus or a way to start talking about the same sort of things, you end up in a spot where either recruitment is very difficult and fractured, or you make mistakes. Like, people get caught up in all sorts of biases, like groupthink or recency bias or all sorts of other elements. The thing that about statistics, we view it as a supplement to video. It's the next step, the next evolutionary step in watching guys on video, because instead of watching a single game, you suddenly get every touch that they've had throughout the whole of the season. Right. It's not perfect. You'll still make mistakes. It's impossible because you're dealing with humans, regardless of how good you are. Like, humans are complex and things happen. But it's definitely a step that was very useful in our clubs. And going back to the success thing, like, we had a huge transfer surplus in 2015-16. I think it was like plus 15 million pounds. We fell to 9th in the league, but a lot of that was based on a fairly poor managerial signing that we had a hard time recovering from at the beginning. That my group didn't have any advice on that one. So unfortunately, I think manager profiling is also a huge area that statistics can be used in, but we weren't used at that point for that particular purpose. So I think that we're successful.
Oh, sorry for interrupting. I was going to ask, what sort of metrics would you judge a manager or a coach on?
Part of it is profiling for the club. Like, what sort of style do you want to play? Right. That's actually a big deal. And if you get a head coach or a manager that doesn't fit your style of play, especially the style that the squad has been built around, you'll end up with some rough spots, and your performance might not be as good as you want, or you'll just be disappointed in the product that goes on the pitch because of the way that the coaching style works. Additionally, you can profile what the style they're doing. You can also profile their success. Like, the league table doesn't always tell the full story. We look at kind of underlying things like expected goals and chance creation, and were they giving up big chances in defense and stuff like that. And we felt that was a much better way to help look at head coaches than simply how they've done at their most recent club.
My final question before we get a bit more sort of theoretical is what's your opinion about the current appreciation for analytics among professional teams? Because I feel like, from my perspective, I keep reading stories about how oh, this is going to change everything, and then, oh, this is not happening now. And it seems to be reported as it's either like a boom or a bust. But I'm imagining that the story from someone who's more involved is somewhere in the middle. So what's the reception of analytics at teams in general, either in England or around the world?
There are a couple of clubs in England that are doing this fairly aggressively. Arsenal have been doing this for a long time. They bought their own data company called StatDNA. The people there are very sharp. I think Liverpool have been doing this in some way. Whether or not they had buy-in during the Rodgers years is a big question. And that kind of summarizes one of the big issues. Like, if you're interested in it, fine, but just having the knowledge isn't good enough to improve you. You also have to execute, and your decision-making is very important. So you need to be committed from the pitch all the way up to the boardroom to say that we're going to start to incorporate this stuff, and it's going to impact our decisions, and it matters to us, and we're going to act like it matters. We're not just going to build better information and say we're doing analytics. And it's the exact same thing that we saw in American sports as well. Some clubs would hire analysts and then stuff them away in the edge of the stadium in a closet and say, hey, yeah, we've got an analytics department. And then other clubs were working hand in hand with the director or GM. And that was how they built their entire process around incorporating this objective information into how they operate as a club, whether that's the coaching side, whether it's the recruitment side, whether it's medical, sports science, etc. To me, that's the right way to go about it. I don't think that any clubs outside of maybe Arsenal right now have the entire pathway built so that they're operating in that way. There are a lot of edges that people leave, I guess you'd say, on the table. But over the next 5 to 10 years, I think you'll see more and more clubs come around to that because it's the exact same evolutionary process we've seen in other sports.
Hey, it's Daryl and Taylor here, letting you know that today's show is sponsored by Blue Apron, the #1 fresh ingredient and recipe delivery service in the country.
That's right. Blue Apron's mission is to make incredible home cooking accessible to everyone, and they've made it accessible to us.
That's right. We have ordered our first Blue Apron meals. We went to the website, we signed up, it's on the way. We have a bit of a split of opinion in terms of how we want to do this, though, right? Mm-hmm. You've gone meaty, I've gone vegetarian.
I have, yes. I'm okay with meat, provided that it's raised responsibly, which it is, courtesy of Blue Apron. So yes, I've gone meat eater style. They do have vegetables in there still too. You've gone plant eater style.
Yeah, I've gone vegetarian. I've actually been vegetarian for nearly a year now, but I can tell you it does matter what your ingredients are. A vegetarian meal is only as good as the ingredients. As Blue Apron say, all ingredients are not created equal.
I would agree with that. And since I'm getting mine first, I know you're going out of town for a little bit, so I'll be getting mine, then you'll be getting yours. So maybe I'll run everybody through what I'm going to be getting. I'm getting Peebles-style pork, seared chicken and mashed potatoes, and Indonesian spiced salmon, all of which sound delicious, all of which come with side dishes as well.
All right. And my understanding is you're going to get step-by-step instructions on how to prepare these things.
I believe you are correct. I believe it comes refrigerated as well, so I don't have to rush to get into the fridge and avoid, the dogs that will be trying to eat it, I'm sure.
And we'll be keeping you, keep the dogs down.
Yeah, right?
No counter surfing. I'm genuinely excited to be getting this because it's meals that I wouldn't think to prepare myself, right? And I wouldn't know to go shopping for the ingredients, but it all comes in a box with instructions, and then you're good to go.
Mm-hmm. So if you're interested in this, if you want to see what else is out there, you can check out this week's menu and get the first 3 meals free with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/TSS.
You'll love how good it feels and tastes to create incredible home-cooked meals with Blue Apron, so don't wait.
That's blueapron.com/TSS.
Blue Apron, a better way to cook.
Now back to Daryl's interview.
I want to ask you now about Statsbomb and specifically about the radars. And if people are unfamiliar, these are it's statistical data presented in a very sort of visually appealing way where you can probably describe it better than me, Ted, but the way I see it is various sort of, say, on-target shot percentage or things like that are represented by a spread across a sort of circular radar. To me, at least, it makes it a lot easier to absorb the information and to compare similar players. So I wanted to ask you about, first of all, did I describe that even close to correctly? Second of all, was the idea to try and make the statistics more understandable in a visual medium?
Absolutely. I think you'll see in my early work, and most people's early work they're not very happy with, so I look back on it and kind of sigh, but it's a process. In my early work, I used a lot of numbers, and I was looking for a way to take the numbers and make them more interesting, and also to, people don't engage with tables and numbers, and in many cases they don't engage with bar charts either. So what happened at the beginning of, I think, the end of 2014 was that I started looking at visualization work, and people like Alberto Cairo and Tufta and Stephen Few, Nathan Yao. And I spent probably a good 3 months like really reading up on this way of looking at data, and not becoming an expert, but at least having a decent knowledge of it. And then around the same period of time, I ran across an NBA All-Star poster by a guy named Ramimo, who I think actually works for maybe ESPN the magazine. He's a very cool designer, and he had tossed a bunch of NBA stats on this radar chart, this type of visualization. And I was like, oh, that's really cool. I bet you could do that for soccer. And so I kind of spent the next 2 months figuring out what mattered for each position. And the early ones looked just at what we call descriptive stats. So, non-penalty goals and shots and shooting percentage and stuff like that. And then gradually built out the templates. And the early ones made Messi and Ronaldo made everybody else, even average players, look terrible. So what I did at that point was I started to apply some data science to it and said, okay, what if we basically take two standard deviations, or in this case, a little different. We make the edge of the shot rings 95% and 5%, and say, what if we do it that way? How do these average players start to look? Does it show the profiles better? And the other thing I did was I started to invert things that were bad. So because a radar style visualization is when you project it, the more area that it covers, it typically means better. So if we take something that's a bad thing, like say fouls, and we invert the axis so that more fouls actually mean you cover less, then maybe we get a better picture. And I found that these were kind of cool, obviously, but also the fans really responded to them, and they are very engaging. And one of the unexpected things was that people respond to the shapes, and the shapes start to mean something in a particular style of player, as long as you've done all of the axes sort of in a sensible way. They'll never be perfect. They have weaknesses. Every visualization style does. But I found them to be the best way of looking at players quickly and getting a sense of how they play, are they very good, and what style of player are they for their particular template.
Yeah, so the way I see it is you can get 5 defensive midfielders, and you can stack up their interceptions, tackles, ball recoveries, that kind of stuff, and you can literally see who has the most. And I think all the stats are per 90, right? So it all should match up on a sort of really easy to compare basis.
Right, and kind of the idea behind that was, as a kid, I loved baseball cards, and I wanted to have some sort of informational fidelity. So, we'd be able to talk about how many home runs somebody had in a year, what their on-base percentage or batting average was, etc. I was like, all right. I'm going
to pretend I know what all those things mean.
Yeah, sure. But because of that, I was like, okay, well, I want people to be able to talk about this. So instead of making them into percentiles, as you might do to be more statistically correct, let's just do the 5% and 95%, and then leave the actual numbers up there so that people can talk about it. What was Lionel Messi's actual goals scored? The amazing year that he had, 42 goals or something like that. And so what was his per 90? And the assists for a Mesut Ozil and things like that. So people would be able to remember this. So that was why we ended up kind of where we did. And the numbers, to me, I don't know how successful it's been. I think people still clamor for it. And I'll post a 5-minute radar request line on my Twitter, and I get literally 100+ requests these days. So
I can definitely say from my perspective, as someone who's kind of interested in stats but isn't good at absorbing them, the radars were a thing that really got my attention as that's something I can visually understand, and it really pulled me into it a little bit more.
And I think the other thing that I found was quite cool is that it allows us to compare over years as well. So I use the tool very differently than people will see it on the Twitter account, but I can just it's an easy drop down to go from, Messi 2010 to Messi 2016. And we see like adjustments, and you'll see, I think for a while I did things on Statsbomb called Giffolutions, which basically they looked at, 4 or 5 years worth of player stats, and they looked at how the player developed over that time period. And that ended up being quite useful as well. So it ended up filling a lot of holes. And what we found on a practical side at the club level was that literally this sort of process allowed us to go through something like 1,000 players in a season. We'd get a list of, say, 20 players in an agent email, and we'd look at any of the ones that we could really fast, like maybe 2-3 minutes each, and just chuck right through them. If you think about it from a different perspective, how much time would you have to watch each of those players to get any sort of sense of whether they're good enough, or how they play, or what sort of statistics they produce? Like, we ended up short-circuiting all of that, and it made it so that we could go much faster on a recruitment workflow, despite only having like 3 or 4 guys working across 2 clubs and then some part-time scouts.
So is that kind of your core business, is to essentially be a consultant for people who will then request your advice about various players or various needs?
That's what we're just starting to we'll launch this, I think, either on Monday or Tuesday, the Statsbomb Services website. And what I realized was that there's this hole in the market right now where people don't have anybody they can go to and ask stats questions, or to be able to advise clubs on how they might apply this. So what we did was, when I came out back in, say, April, I was like, all right, I want to rebuild my tool set, because like everything I had before was built inside the club. And so I said, well, let's build a new radar generator. Let's build the shot maps. We kind of have their soccer shot maps. They were, at least the idea was to build something a bit like Kirk Goldsberry does in basketball. But the problem is that you just don't have as many shots in basketball as you do in soccer. So we built something like that for both teams and for players. Then we started looking at, some things like team radars. Are those interesting? What can we do there? Different visualization styles to say, okay, not only are we going to cover recruitment, which I think at this point for us is somewhat straightforward, even though we're developing new metrics, but we're also going to build a tool that will allow clubs to see opposition scouting. What's my next club? What's the next team that we're going to face look like? Do they press? Do they not press? Do they shoot a lot? Do they hold teams to very few shots? Do they get good shots off, like high XG shots? And also looking at the game stuff too. So being able to go through a meeting inside of your own club and say, okay, this is how we looked. This is the stats that we produced. Because right now, I think inside of a football club, it's very daunting to have a lot of data thrown at you by a data provider and say, here, go ahead. And right. What I found was that the tools weren't particularly great. They weren't simple necessarily, but they also weren't super insightful. And that may change over time. So what we decided was, okay, we'll build this platform. And one of the things the Statsbomb Services will do will be, a bit like Y-Scout or something like that. We'll provide a statistical platform for clubs to operate from, to do recruitment, opposition scouting, self-scouting, evaluation, etc. And then the other side of it is exactly what you're talking about, to be able to give sort of player evaluations. Recruitment is very political in many cases, and so we decided that we'd be an objective place to evaluate players, but also to give valuations. Like, over the last 4 years, I've probably done 1,000 players and said, I think this is the value that this player should cost, whether it's on Twitter or inside of the clubs or whatever. And I think that using the economics background that we talked about before, using the experience in betting and gambling, which you're always looking at what is the right price, we found a pretty good way to add transfer valuations as well. And so that's another thing that clubs can come to us and say, what do you have an opinion here? Coach searches. And then there's a final thing that is a practical coaching thing, which is the set piece program that I developed at the beginning of when I started working with Brentford and Midtjylland.
So can I assume Statsbomb Services will not be public facing? It'll have to be, you'd need to be sort of a club or other professional that would sign up.
Absolutely. Club or like a soccer federation.
Even if I Google really hard, I wouldn't be able to find it.
Well, there'll be a website.
Okay.
And
right.
You can poke around on there. It's technically it's out there right now. It's a very in progress website, but it's statsbombservices.com. And I think that Well, all the feedback we've had has been great. We've had a couple of Champions League clubs on the beta testing it out last year. We had one of the big national teams looking at it. We've had a number of smaller places look at it. And one of the things I found amazing was that like two of the clubs that we allowed to have a quick beta, like a 2-week beta, they used it 600, 700 times in that period. So like much like you get excited about it, at the club level, we're also seeing some people get excited there too.
I've got a few quick questions about stats for you. What is the one stat that you see repeated and used, like one measurement that you see repeated and used in the media and by fans that you think is not that useful and you think maybe we should stop talking about?
Possession, I think, is pretty poor and has been used for many years. But I think the biggest one that irritates me is sorry, there might be some kids in the background.
No problem.
The biggest one that irritates me is distance run. Because it's absolutely meaningless. It's just something they're able to quote and say, "Oh, look at this team that ran more than the other one." But no one's done any research as to the value of that. And we know that high intensity sprints probably matter a lot more, but you don't get much of that information. It's a mess, and I hate it.
So I was recently being all excited about Adam Lallana, because I'm sure you saw that stat that he sort of ran the most distance in both of the Christmas and New Year games for Liverpool of anybody in the Premier League. So sure. Was that not a stat worth getting excited about?
It might be. It's a piece of trivia more than something you can apply to a game. Fair
enough. And there was that
and to be fair,
excellent sprint where he put the cross in for Wijnaldum's goal. So at least
that's true.
That one good sprint, right?
I'm not saying anything against the usage of this. I'm saying that they're utterly unproven to have a relationship to game outcomes.
I see.
But on the other hand, so many of the statistics that get used in media are trivia, and we love trivia. So you go down for a pub quiz, and it's fun, right? And that's the same sort of thing.
So in terms of media and fans and, let's say, podcasts having a better understanding of the game, what is one stat that you would like to see included more in sort of coverage of the game?
I wrote a piece about this called X Commentary that was back towards the end of last year, basically looking at the commentators that say he should score. And the fact that the world has such a warped idea of what a good chance is or how easy a chance is versus not. And one of the things that I kind of pitched was just put an expected goals value on the screen for every shot that comes up. It's really easy. Our models have it. If you're doing it in sort of a post-facto environment, a highlights environment, like a match of the day, you just toss it up every shot. Here's the expected goals value. And the thing about it is, the models aren't perfect. And for a single shot, the model has a pretty big error bar. But it gives you a talking point that you can then start to argue about either way. And that gives the commentators that have expertise in this something that they can comment about. It gives the fans a much clearer idea of whether that Zlatan header from 9 yards out at an angle was actually a good one or not. And it gives everybody just a little more information that adjusts their knowledge of the game, and I think improves it overall.
This brings us to, I think this was the original thing I emailed you about, is I was really hoping to get you on the show to explain expected goals, because I think it's a thing that I see a lot of, and it seems to be mostly about sort of where the chance is from and how difficult it is, but I still don't fully understand what the numbers mean. So would you be able to, in a relatively simple way, talk me and maybe any of our listeners through it who don't understand it?
Okay, so the number essentially is a probability that shot would become a goal.
Okay.
So, a 0.6 is, 60% of the time that particular shot would be a goal. 0.6 is a very high quality chance. The average quality chance for the Premier League is about 10.5, somewhere around there. So, basically 1 in every 10 shots would turn into a goal.
Okay.
So there are 4 ways that I kind of break down the idea of expected goals. The first one is distance matters. So the further away you are from the goal, the less likely a shot is to be a goal. Part of that is because, it's harder to get it on target. Part of it is goalkeeper reaction time. Part of it is often the number of guys between the shooter and the goal itself. They're more likely to get blocked, etc. So distance matters. The further you are away, like go out on the pitch, like shoot from 23 yards and then shoot from 3 yards or 6 yards, and you'll notice it immediately yourself.
So you're saying that distance is weighed into the number that you come up with?
Yep,
okay.
Absolutely. Angle also matters. So if you're shooting from wide, you're less likely to get a goal. And this mostly has to do with the goalkeeper positioning and how easy it is to cover the angle of the goal. It's a bit of trigonometry. You're actually using trigonometry in the real world. So, if you are a math teacher, you can go back to your kids and say, hey, look at this. You're actually using it in the real world. It's very exciting. But also it's a basic principle that says that as you get to the side, you have less of the goal to aim for as well. So those are the first two elements. Angle and distance matter. The next one is that headers are much harder to score than feet from the same distance.
That makes sense.
So they're about half as likely. And if you go out and you do things with your head and then you do it with your feet, almost regardless of how good or bad you are, you'll notice a significant disparity between how easy those are to deal with. The way that I look at it is that you take in kind of a two-dimensional space with your feet, and then you've suddenly turned it into 3 dimensions. It's much more difficult. And also you get to foul guys kind of when they're in the box. You always have a bot on them.
And as a man who's missed many close-range headers, I can attest to this.
Exactly. So it's not my fault. It's just difficult. So those are 2 elements. The third one is that crosses are hard as well. And even if you isolate it with feet. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that one, like crosses aren't very likely to be completed. They have like a 20.5% completion chance on average across all the leagues, but more so that you have to redirect something coming from the side and then make it go forward, which is very difficult as well. So if you keep those 3 ideas in mind, then there are a couple of little wrinkles that say that through balls are the most valuable passes because they typically beat a line of defense. You'll often be one-on-one with a goalkeeper. Dribbles inside the box are useful because also it means that you've usually beaten at least one defender and you've got some space to shoot. And then set pieces are harder to score than other situations because everybody's crowded around in the box typically. So that's the idea behind it. And we used this and we analyzed 1 million shots and we created a model that says on average with these qualifiers from the Opta data set, this is the probability that this shot would be scored.
So when I hear about a team having a certain number of expected goals, I usually see it written as like tiny x big G, I believe. What is that number? Is that all the numbers throughout the game added together? Sure,
that would be like a cumulative amount of shots probabilities that have just been added together. So say for a game, Arsenal had 16 shots and expected goals of 2.25 or something. You know that they had some pretty good chances there because their expected goals are more than like a 10% for each shot that they had. So if they had just had 10%, it'd be 16 equals 1.6. Instead, they had a couple of good chances in there. And good chances are really useful because they're actually more likely to be scored in many cases than, say, you have 20 shots from distance that are all 5% chance. You'd rather have 2 shots from really close that are a 50% chance.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. All right, I'm getting it. I'm excited here. So does that also mean that the expected goals number for the whole team is literally how many goals they are expected to score based on the quality of the chances they had? Is it that simple?
Yep, that's correct.
All right. Ted, thank you. I really feel good to have finally gotten my head around this whole thing.
And people will be very angry to think that you can't have a partial goal, but that's kind of how it works out mathematically. And this is what happens when you take something that's discrete, like a goal, that we only have a 1 or a 0, it's a goal or a not, and then we turn it into maths.
Okay, excellent, Ted. Thank you so much. The final thing I want to basically ask you to tell our listeners about is where else they can find your work. Like I mentioned the podcast earlier, I believe you've been doing some sort of transfer window stuff on the podcast. So yeah, anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners about?
So I've got a huge archive of stuff on statsbomb.com. And if you want to go there, go to authors and Ted Knutson. There are plenty of other good authors there as well. A guy named Dustin Ward's been producing great work. James York, Colin. Plenty of stuff that goes back to 2013 too. So if you wanted to see the really grimy early stuff and the mistakes, it's in there. And we do right now, usually during transfer season, especially as it gets to the close, we'll do almost a weekly podcast where we talk about rumors and do some player evaluations and whether they make sense, whether they don't. Previously, I'd been featured in the Daily Mirror. There was a profile of me in The Sun as well. I have a piece that came up on The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Longtime people maybe I don't know if you're localized to the United States, but I was involved in the Magic the Gathering community for a really long time. Don't go read those, but back from 2002 to 2007, there was a lot of stuff back then. And then, so you've got Statsbomb Services and Mixed Knuts on Twitter. I'll post a lot of radars there pretty regularly, some shot maps once a week. I'll open it up to followers to say, hey, what do you guys want to see? And then I'll post a bunch of those as well.
Great. Thank you, Ted. Oh, and before I let you go, you mentioned getting acclimatized to the US. It seems that you've been in England a while, and you are very sort of involved in English soccer and working with teams there. But is there any chance that you would bring your skills back over to the United States at any point?
Yeah, we've talked to some people in the US about using our product, also about potentially doing the set piece program for an MLS club or two. I have friends who are analysts at MLS clubs. A good friend of mine, Devin Pluler, is the head of analysis, or maybe head of stats at Toronto FC.
Oh, yes. I know Devin. I don't know him, but I know of him. Didn't he work at Opta for a good long while as well?
He did, yeah. And a number of Ravi Ramaneni, who's Seattle Sounders won the league this year. He's a good friend of mine as well. Traveled up to a conference called Cassis with him back in September. Oliver Gage down in Houston. So I have a lot of friends in the U.S. that actually work in the industry. You don't see them publishing because they're not allowed to.
I see. Yeah, because they're working behind the scenes.
If someone wanted to hire us, we're certainly available to clubs all over the world, in fact. So
maybe even to Sunil Gulati and Bruce Arena?
I have not met either of them, but I think the USSF is at least aware of my work.
All right, Ted, well, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your patience explaining expected goals to me. And I wish you all the best.
Well, thanks a lot for having me on. Good luck.